This is a group, a congregation that has been through many changes and has a number of changes up ahead, on the horizon ahead. And so it makes sense to think about reflecting on how those were managed in the past, what went well, what didn't go well, and also doing the work. And of course, there's a lot of work involved in getting ready for transitions, for changes. And it's not only physical work, which is always a part of it, but it also is mental, emotional work, and of course, spiritual work. And so for the next upcoming Sundays, that's really what I'm going to be talking about as you move toward your time of welcoming Reverend Viola, who will be here in August, moving out of this space, moving into a temporary space while your new building is built. Those are all really significant and beautiful changes. Last Sunday, I talked about the idea of crossing a threshold. So moving into what's called a liminal space, where you're leaving behind the known, the things you're familiar with, the things that make you feel comfortable, and moving into the unknown, because there is a lot of unknown up ahead, right? So how do we do the work of preparing for that? Today I want to talk a little bit about I would say, generate thinking around contemplating what it is you take with you and what you leave behind when you're getting ready to move through a change, to move across a threshold, to move through a liminal space. A lot of times life throws us into those places. If you go through something challenging, an illness, a disease, a divorce, a death, etc., you're thrown into a time of change against your will, of course, usually. But right now, we have this incredible opportunity because we are planning. We know what's coming. So it gives us this great opportunity to really do some digging and some deep thinking about what it means to move through these spaces and these times with intention. And even, of course, if you're not going to be here because you're visiting or you come from time to time for these transitions, you're going through them in your own life. Probably most of the time, you're facing these kinds of changes in life, moving through these spaces. And the goal as a human being is to really learn how to do it gracefully, not kicking and screaming, not clinging to what's familiar, not wanting to go back the way it was, but really moving through liminal spaces in time with grace. That's the goal. So I can do what I can do, but I'm a limited human too. So, last Sunday, we spent some time thinking about thresholds. A threshold is a funny, curious thing because it's actually, of course, just a strip of wood at the bottom of a doorway, right? I mean, that's what a threshold is, technically. But we use the term in our lives often to invoke a deeper kind of meaning. The thresholds of our lives are the times when we recognize that something has ended and something else has not usually quite begun yet. Might be a graduation. A lot of that is happening right now. Could be a retirement. That's a big deal in life. The birth of a child, the death of a parent or a partner, a move, a physical move, a marriage, a divorce, a diagnosis. These are all the things that we move through, some of them. We cross these invisible boundaries throughout our entire lives from the moment we arrive here, right? Birth itself is crossing a tremendously meaningful threshold from wherever we come from, somewhere else, 9 months of gestation, and then here we are in this world. So we're doing this throughout all of our lives. And once we have made that transition and we've crossed the threshold, we really are not the person that we were before. We really just are not. As much as we like to think of ourselves as kind of remaining the same, we are not the same person when we come out the other side as we were when we entered into that kind of time. The gift of a threshold in life is that they force us to ask questions. And these are the questions that usually remain kind of hidden underneath the surface of our everyday lives. Questions like, what comes with us? What do we take into this new way of being? And what do we leave behind? Each one of those individually, these are very big questions. What do we take? What do we leave? Imagine for a moment that you had to fit your life into a suitcase, which seems like a very funny thing to contemplate, but I actually met someone once who had to do this. This was a woman who lived in a senior living community in Manchester, Vermont. She was a very quiet, very elegant woman, very rarely spoke, just kind of went about her business very quietly. And one day she sat in our group. We had these Saturday morning groups. We called them the Soul Circle. And she started to tell her story, and I cannot retell it as nearly the way that she did. But she told us a story about when she was a girl, and it was towards the end of World War II, and in the village where she lived, and I apologize, I don't remember which country it was, there was this fear that the Nazi soldiers would be coming through the village, and in particular, targeting the men in the village. And so there was an understanding that they had to leave. And indeed, one night, she said, my mother said, take this suitcase and go upstairs and put whatever you can into it. And she tells the story of going to her bureau, filling it with whatever she didn't even remember. But she did remember the details. She said, I will never forget the chicken dinner sitting on the dining room table that night as we left our home. So they started to flee. They got on a train, they were in motion, they got off the train somewhere. They had to flee into the mountains and camp for a while. They had nothing. But somehow her family ended up in an entirely new country with absolutely nothing and rebuilt their lives. And I'll never forget looking at this woman and thinking, look at her now. If a human being can go through all of that and get to this place, I can go through anything. I know that I can go through anything. It was an incredible gift to be in the presence of someone that shared a story like that, her whole life into a suitcase. If any of us had to do that under normal circumstances, I think that we would realize very quickly that we have accumulated far more than we can carry, right? I mean, there's that question, right, of if there's a fire, what do you grab when you're on your way out? Has anyone actually ever experienced that? When I was writing this, I was very curious. Has everyone ever actually had a house fire or a situation where you had to run and grab what little you could? Very interesting. I was a volunteer firefighter when I lived in Charlotte, and I was always curious about that. There were never really any house fires. There were a lot of barn fires, but I always wondered it made me think, look around, what would I take, if anything? I don't even know, really. Crossing thresholds, the kind that we're talking about, of course, is about much more than material things. Much, much, much more. Though we tend very often to think about it that way. What will I take? What is important? When we begin to move beyond our physical possessions, that's when we begin to contemplate the larger questions. I would frame it this way. What from your life story would you place in that suitcase? Which memories? Which lessons that you've learned along the way? Which relationships, which values, which disappointments? What were some of your most important teachers? Which hopes? What would you take with you if you were thinking about your life story, not the things you've accumulated? When we're young in life, I think we often move through the world as kind of collectors, right? We're collecting a lot of stuff. We collect experiences, credentials, possessions, achievements, opinions too, for sure. We gather and we gather and we gather when we're young. I think this is sort of what we feel like we're supposed to do. And then if you've lived long enough, you know this, somewhere along the way, usually later than it should, I would say, or later than we expect, we begin to realize that life is less about accumulation and more about discernment. Has anyone gotten to that place, would you say? Yeah. Less about accumulation and more about discernment. The challenge is no longer in figuring out how to acquire more. The challenge is really figuring out what deserves a place on the journey of your life. What is worth preserving as you move through your days? This congregation, this group of wonderful human beings in this beautiful group, this Unitarian Universalist condition, this group is facing these questions now. Whether you're thinking about it or not, these questions are on the table. This place, this group was here before most of us, although is anyone here from the very start? Has anyone been here from the very beginning? Oh my goodness, there we go. We have a few, I love that. But most of us have not been here that long. And with good fortune and wise stewardship, this will continue long after we're all gone. And when you stop to think about that, it's a very humbling thing, really, that every congregation is occupying just a brief moment in what we hope is a much longer story. Over the course of its existence, any congregation goes through many transitions. Ministers come and go, and I would say that happens more often in the modern days than it did in the past. Ministers are on the move. A lot of them are staying with congregations for shorter periods of time for various reasons. But ministers come and go, people move away, people die, children grow up through the group and then they leave. And then sometimes a new building becomes part of the story too. I would say that institutions take a certain comfort in believing that continuity can be located in things like buildings and budgets and committees and strategic plans. And all of those things do, of course, have their role. They have their important place. Every congregation requires a very practical framework within which the spiritual life of the group can unfold. But anyone who has spent any time in spiritual communities knows that the soul of the congregation cannot be found in the extraneous objects that fill the space that we as humans occupy every Sunday. The soul of the congregation. And I would guess that most of us experienced this to some degree during the time of COVID, when every building that housed every faith community on the planet was closed, right? Do you remember that feeling? Who are we when we no longer have a building to go to on a Sunday morning? So beyond the material things, the objects, the infrastructure, the members, what matters? What remains when all of these things have changed, when all is gone? What matters? This is a big question. Can you answer it in your own mind right now? What matters? One way that I would respond to this, and there of course are many ways, all of us are responding differently in our own hearts. What carries forward is what we might call culture. What carries forward is memory. What carries forward is the accumulated wisdom of the group. What carries forward is hopefully a shared understanding of what matters and what deserves our attention. It is, I'll say this a lot in the coming weeks, it is a really good time now to revisit these parts of this congregation. Why does it exist? And this I brought up early on when I was speaking here, but it's a really good thing to ponder. If this whole thing disappeared off the face of the earth tomorrow, poof, gone, what would the community miss? What would the larger community, not us, but Saratoga Springs, the place where this is housed, what would the town miss? Because that answers the question, what are we doing? Who are we out there? That's a really important thing to think about. I know that Reverend Viola is going to do this work with this congregation when she arrives. I know that she will be taking you through some of these processes. One of the temptations, I think, during a time of transition is to really be sort of, to be thinking about the questions of preservation. Like, we wonder, some of us might be a little nervous about what familiar things are going to change during this time. Well, certainly your surroundings, right? I mean, that's the first one. And that's a big deal. You'll be in a different space for a while as the new space is built. That's a big deal. Who will we be? What do we take? How do we behave? Human beings, I would say for, I don't even know, thousands of years, every generation believes that it is living through a uniquely turbulent period. And certainly we are living through some very, very hard times right now. I think every generation probably worries to some degree that the future will somehow fail to appreciate what was valuable in the past. There is probably a good reason why so many ancient texts contain reminders about being courageous, because anxiety about change is one of humanity's, I would say, oldest traditions. Being nervous about change. This is woven into us, really. Feels sometimes like it's in our DNA, right? When you know something is changing, how do you feel? You feel it physically, right? But I think if you really take the time and think about our lives from a historical perspective, you'll see that I think the things that matter most are actually pretty resilient, if you think about it. Compassion somehow survives all the madness. Human compassion somehow survives, and indeed often bubbles up during some of the most difficult times in our lives, right? You know this. Remember what happened after 9/11? How wonderful, how beautiful. After that incredible tragedy, how kind people were, how so many people wanted to figure out a way to help during that time. The hardest times, we know this, somehow bring out the very best of us. Curiosity somehow survives, I would say, for most people. Generosity definitely survives. Hopefully, too, that I would say a genuine commitment to truth survives. I hope. This is really what human resilience looks like, and we all have it, and we've all been through hard times. We've all got it in us. How do you get through a hard time? You remember how you got through other hard times in your life. You have that within you already. These are the qualities, I think, that really have traveled across cultures, across centuries, across political systems, across periods of both prosperity and hardship in our lives. And the reason they survive is because they are rooted in human beings, not in structures. The structures come and go, the structures rise and fall, but these things, these are what are rooted in us. And that, I think, is why we carry them forward, sometimes really even unconsciously. And I think, too, that this is why every threshold has both loss and beautiful possibility. Something stays. Hopefully, in a case like this, we leave behind the things that no longer serve. Some things we have to let go of. Old ideas about who or what we are, because think about it, you're moving into a whole new space one day. You're building this beautiful new building. And that is an invitation to the larger community. Come, see who we are, see what we are. You're new, you'll be different, different place, different dynamics. That means you welcome new life. What does that mean? Something is always falling away, and life is always asking us to release what can no longer accompany us. Yet every threshold also reveals, I would say, what has become so deeply woven into our character that it remains part of us wherever we go. And that can be the beauty. Really, it's deeply woven into us. What carries communities forward is a shared commitment to keep asking the worthwhile questions. Just think about that for a second. A commitment to keep asking. It's a process that never ends. To keep asking the worthwhile questions, to keep revisiting covenants, to keep revisiting language, to keep revisiting reason and purpose. And to keep widening the circle of belonging, ever widening. What does it mean to be a universalist? What does it mean in practice? We know what it means in language. We're surrounded by the words. What does it mean in practice? When you invite all beings, when you invite all ideas, when you invite people from every walk of life, what does it mean in terms of being welcoming? What does it mean? A shared commitment to keep asking the worthwhile questions, to keep choosing compassion over indifference, and to continue to show up for one another, even when the future is hazy. Especially in this case where the future is it's unknown, right? We don't know. Where are we going? We don't really know yet. We know Viola is coming, and that's really exciting. Where are we going? We're not sure. We'll know when we get there. You're going to be pilgrims. That's a really beautiful thing to be, right? To be pilgrims on a journey together. It is an opportunity. I'm going to say this every single week. It's an opportunity to show the world how to cross a scary threshold with grace and courage. With grace and courage. Here's how it's done. We're going to each individually choose, and that becomes the collective, to cross the threshold, to enter into the liminal space with grace and courage. There's a beautiful film that I want to recommend. It's called The Last Ecstatic Days. Has anybody seen it? Oof, this is a good one, especially if you're interested in end-of-life things. It's about a gentleman named Ethan Sisser, who at a very young age, in his 30s, was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer, and he begins live streaming his experience. He decides to live every day in an ecstatic state and to share the joy that he's experiencing with the rest of the world. He chooses to teach people how to die without fear. It's extraordinary. He moves from a hospital. He doesn't have a home to go to. A whole community builds up around him in Asheville, North Carolina. The doctor who was, I believe, his doctor in the hospital goes with him to be part of the hospice team. And I can only say it's one of the most courageous dying stories that I have ever seen. Ethan chose to use his hardest days to become a model and a teacher. I would encourage you to allow that to give you courage along the way, stories like that. Here's the thing. Even without a threshold, this kind of work, this asking the big, worthwhile questions, widening the circle, what that means, what that looks like, this has always been the work, the real work of congregational life. And sometimes I think we forget that because there's so much else going on all the time. Questions that need to be answered, budgets that need to be dealt with, issues of personnel. How does this work? What's going to happen? Do we have the money? All the big questions, the infrastructure, right? But the real work of any congregational life is digging into those big questions. Who are we? Why do we exist? How do we widen this circle with grace? It was the work before most of us got here, and hopefully it will remain the work long after we're gone. We have an opportunity right now to really build a foundation on that, right? I said it last week, we're building a whole new architecture. What an amazing opportunity it is. It might sound like a lot, and it might sound quite sobering and maybe a little scary, until we recognize the gift hidden within it, of course. Don't forget this part. You don't have to carry everything forward. You only have to carry what truly matters. So in our few moments of just quiet introspection, I would encourage you to start thinking about that. What truly matters? In our own lives, as we move through liminal spaces, think about it. Prepare yourself if you're not in one right now. Think about it ahead of time. What truly matters to us individually and especially here collectively? What do we take? What do we leave when we move forward? We begin the process of moving forward. So just a few moments of quiet introspection.